right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today's session, Ecology of Self, Transformational Practices with John Vervaeke and Bonnitta Roy. And this is a co-hosted event with the Pop-Up School. So this is the first recorded conversation between John and Bonnitta, and I'm very happy that this is hosted at the Stoa. Personally speaking, John and Bonnitta's work both have profoundly influenced me. And it kind of feels like my philosophical dad and mom are like finally meeting. So I'm like totally geeking out about this. And basically, I just really wanted them to meet, hence suggesting this session for them. And so the title is almost like an aside, but it was inspired by one of Bonnitta's sessions at the Stoa, which is one of my favorite sessions at the Stoa of all times, her integrative model of the self. And John has also been doing a lot of great work on the Elusive I series. And he actually just finished a course, I think, at the U of T on the self with his students, which is cool synchronicity. So I thought this would be a good point, starting point for the inquiry, talking about the self, the nature of the self, and weaving it into this, the goal of transformational practices, which both John and Bonnitta talk a lot about. So how today's going to work, I'm going to tag in Bonnitta in a moment, and John and Bonnitta will have an exchange perhaps for 30 or 45 minutes. And then whenever Bonnitta feels like it's the right time, she'll take me in and we'll have Q&A. We're here for 75 minutes in total. John has to leave about 15 minutes before the 90-minute mark. And if you have any questions anytime, just put in the chat, and then the Q&A portion, I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself and I'll ask your question to Bonnitta or John. And then the rough question that we came up with is, what does the phrase of ecology of self mean to your work? And how does the goal of transformational practices relate to it? But knowing Bonnitta, she's probably going to talk about whatever she wants to talk about right now. And then they can riff on for about 30, 45 minutes. So that being said, Bonnitta, tagging you in. And you got to unmute yourself.
Okay, now I'm good. Yeah, thanks, Peter, and thanks everyone for being here, and special thanks to John for taking the time to be with us. I think I'm going to frame the ecology of selves in two different ways. One is I will answer the question or try to address the question, but when I think of these kinds of conversations, and I know some people have actually had this conversation with me, you could really, if you watch John's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, or you watch a lot of the work he does, you can really grok what he's saying. You can really recognize that he's pointing to your own lived experience. You learn a lot from him. And then maybe you come over and you do the origins of the self with me. And it's a comprehensive system. And so it draws you in. And so the largest framing is, do these two different models and do these two different approaches constitute themselves an ecology? And we can bring other people into that. And when people ask me that, I always defer. I always say that the people who are inherently drawn to both our works, they're in a better position, I think, to answer that question. Or at least maybe I'm just a coward and I don't want to answer that question. I want to go meta on it. But we live in interesting times because in the past, people would try to investigate the self, get involved for a long time in one organization or one cult or one tradition, and then be shocked that there are other ways to work with the self. So I think that's the largest framing. I just want to acknowledge that it can be confusing to hear different perspectives without a convergence or without a competition. So what do I think about ecologies of self? I think that phrase for me means that the self is a holistic participation of many selves, let's say, or it is itself an ecology at all levels, and it comprises an extra self ecology with other selves, right? So this notion of not a linear hierarchy. A lot of, when you switch to ecological thinking, You don't have like the food chain and the man at the top. You have complex, holistic, spherical interdependencies of dynamic participation. And I think the healthy self is like that there's a dynamic participation between the body, the mind, the psyche, the extra psychic self, and nature. And to the extent that when you're embedded or you occupy that view, it makes no sense anymore to go, here, me, point into the center of my chest. That's myself. So it's very conventional to our culture. Here's myself. Where are you? Here. So when you occupy the ecology, the self as an ecology, that move doesn't make any meaning anymore. So yeah, I'll stop there.
First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here with Peter. It's a great pleasure. I got the great pleasure to talk to Bonnitta a couple of weeks ago. And first of all, I doubt very highly that you're a coward, Bonnitta. So I don't think that's an explanation. I do take what you said seriously, that, there's a problem. And it's a general problem. It's not a problem specific to you and I. This is the jingle jangle problem that's, in psychology in general, multiple terminologies, multiple ontologies. As a cognitive scientist, I face this all the time. Even multiple ontologies and multiple methods for talking about the mind, and equivalently, I think, for talking about the self. So I think doing this carefully and cooperatively, and paying attention to people who have been attracted to your work and to my work and our work together, I think that's very good. Hopefully we have such a forum right now. So I'll say what I hear with ecology of self, and where I think there's potentially, it seems to me, deep agreement. So first of all, I want to be very careful. We have to distinguish between two different uses of this word. And this is very important because these uses get confused. There's a function of the word self that doesn't imply that there is an entity or self present. When I say a tornado spins upon itself, I don't mean that there's a self, that the tornado possesses a self. We use the word self to mean a recursive function. Can language be about itself? Yes, it can, but that doesn't mean there's a self of language, right? So we want to be very careful to not confuse these two different meanings, because this confusion is pretty rife in a lot of conversation about the self. So we want to distinguish just a recursive use, which is the self functions grammatically to when we're ever pointing on a process that feeds back on, here it comes, itself, from an entic use of the word self, which is we're pointing to an entity that we claim exists in some realistic fashion, the self. So first of all, for me, it's very careful to pull those two apart. There are many things that are self-organizing, even self-making, like a paramecium, but I don't think a paramecium has a self in the sense that we're talking about here. I think lots of things are relevant to it, but that doesn't mean that it has a self. So for me, as a cognitive scientist, I'm engaged in a project of trying to hopefully explain how you can go from the first to the second. How is it that various self-organizing and self-making processes, that's what autopoiesis means, how could those processes and functions give rise to the kind of entity we take ourselves to be? And for me, that's a very important question. How does this relate to ecologies of the self? Well, I happen to think that minded things and living things require a process, which I've talked about at length elsewhere, called relevance realization. They have to determine that some information is relevant, other information is irrelevant, and they have to care about that information. They have to invest their metabolic resources, their temporal resources, and perhaps they even have some cognitive resources. So they have to care about some information because they're taking care of themselves. This leads to a phenomena that is well evidenced in psychology, which is called self-relevance. When information is relevant to you, it actually acts as a powerful mechanism by which your cognition and your perception is bound together. So all organisms, now this is where we have to be very careful. All organisms have self-relevance in this sense. They have to make information relevant to them. They have to bind it. They have to care about it. Now, what's interesting about this is that, and I won't go into the details, but the idea is that this function works at many different levels, at many different time scales. And as Bonnitta, and I think I'm in agreement with her, you shouldn't see this as a simplistic linear hierarchy. There is, right, a kind of ability to make things relevant to yourself that is in the right here and now, like my ability to move myself around the environment. And so I have to have some minimal model of myself in order to make things relevant to me, in order to move around in the environment. I think it's very plausible that cats and dogs have that. I don't know how they could move around in the environment if they couldn't, to some degree. Look, one of the things your brain has to do is model your head movements so that when you move your head, your vision doesn't go all wonky. If you don't have that function of self-modeling, whenever you moved or whenever you did anything, your perception would get all skewed. So you're already modeling yourself at that level. This is right. But then we do something very interesting with that. We take that up into like a narrative function where we extend the temporal scope of how I am interacting with the world, and we correspondingly deepen the model of ourselves in response to that. And we become temporally extended self. So you can do bizarre things like point at a picture of you as a 2-year-old and say, there I am, which is a really, really bizarre thing to do. No other organism can do that. And it's only because of narrative that you can do something like that. But then, and again, this is also where I think Bonnitta and I are in agreement, that temporally extended self is also being transformed into being a person, which means you become even more deeper in your modeling of yourself by internalizing how other people model you. And you take that into your model and you get, right, the social self, what we typically call a person. Now, I presented it like this because I'm talking about, right, the explanatory relations, but I do not see it like this. Right. I see it all interpenetrating and dynamically self-organizing. But so at some point, oh, go ahead, Bonnitta.
No, so I just, yeah, so let me, because I'm going to get lost here. So I just wanted to reflect back some of the points that we're trying to build here.
Yeah.
So I use the metaphor of the tornado all the time when we'll get to the point where people like self, no self. Yeah. And I think it's an important distinction. And for me, it's, I'll say, when there is no longer any tornado, what is lost? What is lost? Is there anything lost? So we point to the tornado, and the reason why we make it a thing is because it has causal effective consequences.
Yes.
So, which are different than when it's organized in a different way. And one of the things that we do a deep dive in, this is pretty sophisticated, but we start to understand that our expectations around causality is part of why we posit a self. Okay, so we play around with certain meditative practices. They're fun, where we look at, for example, what is wind? We only see, wind never appears. Wind is the cause. We only see the effects. It's a very powerful meditation, standing in a meadow. Where is the wind? And you can get so that you start to realize that the self doesn't appear because it's like the wind. Only its effects appear. This really begins to create a very participative experience. So anyways, that's just, I went down a rabbit hole just to give you like the flavor where we go with it. So yes, starting with the metaphor of the tornado, that's very powerful, and it's very normal. It normalizes it. In terms of relevance realization, I have a different term. We look, we go to cognitive science, and we look at the continuity of these mapping systems. Yes. Way down. Cats and rats, Vervaeke has very clear neuroscience that they map, rats will, rats will run combinations of mazes in their dreams. Yes. Yeah. So all this stuff. Okay. So we know there's a lot of continuity, and I use in my work, sorry about the dogs, in my work, I make the distinction that James Austin makes, and that is there are allocentric perceptual pathways and there are egocentric perceptual pathways. And all mammals have this, birds obviously, and these pathways are, what just happened? I got very big all of a sudden. These pathways are, have affective markers, right? Yes. So the allocentric pathways, if you're talking about the visual field, is like my babies, my bone, and the whole organism is what's relevant or salient is a very specific field of vision, or auditory or relevance. And then there's allocentric pathways where there's salience in other directions. Yes. And so when Greg Enriquez talks about the justificatory system, and you talk about relevance realization, we talk about these allocentric and egocentric pathways that we inherit from the mammals, and then they become virtualized in the visual virtual perceptions, right? So for example, when a crow, you give them a test and there's 5 or 6 different stages, it can virtualize the environment in its perceptual system and predict how it should act. And maybe it gets one step wrong or something, right? So that's the environment is virtualized as mind. It's a simulated prediction, and it has external perceptions. And then we say that that's the allocentric pathway. And then we say the egocentric pathway gets virtualized as psyche, which is the meaning making, because psyche is always like, what is its value relative to me? It's an egocentric. And so we say that these pathways, which are encoded in the neurocognitive architecture of the animals, merely are duplicated as a virtual scenario in the mind and psyche. And so and then that makes that's the relevance realization, like the psyche. These are kind of specific terms, but the egocentric is, what does it mean to me? That's your relevance. And then the simulated perception, which is predictive processing, is I don't know what you have a term for it, but anyway, so that's kind of how we work with it. It maps on very, very well. I just think that we can follow these pathways very clearly neuroanatomically and neuroaffective dynamics in our cousin animals.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. And I think that the self-relevance machinery is balanced or opposed in a functional sense, but like you say, allocentric, because of the mammalian problem, which is even greater in primates, which is the need for the parents to commit to the children, and especially for us, because we have the longest childhood. And so the attachment relationship. So yes, so it's not only for us, it's not only a problem of how things are relevant to me, it's also how am I relevant to things,
Right.
and then ultimately how am I relevant to the conditions for people, other people, right? So we typically are also oriented not just to other people, we're oriented to the conditions that promote the existence of other people. So I think that's, I think that's a fundamental where the self-relevance machinery can get turned onto the possibility of other selves. So I agree with that. I think we're saying the same thing there.
Mhm.
I guess for me, both of those are then taken up into a special domain once we get language. And here's where I agree with Greg. Greg's idea, Greg Enriquez, who's been here, right? His idea is that language changes the self-relevance and the other relevance balance, because it gives you access to my mind in a way that none of my other behavior can. So I become especially vulnerable to you when there's language. And then part of the idea, I think, is we use justification and narrative to manage that imbalance in a particular way.
Yeah, and for me, that's the point of where things really can go wrong. Like because once I realized that I am an object in your awareness, this happens around 2 years old, right? Yes. That I can do something, and unlike objects, which I have to be in physical proximity to, right? Before that, when your baby wants to get your attention and pull on you.
Yeah.
But then at some point, they, the first time they touch the plug, your mother goes, "Oh, don't do that." And you're completely naive. But then at some point you do things like you go over and you look at your mother, and then yes, that movement did something way over there. It's action at a distance.
Yes.
And this is a very interesting stage. So, all kinds of deviant behavior happens, all kinds of lying, and because they're trying to figure out, what is this superpower I have? I'm an object in the awareness of other people. Thank God, this is when it's really important for kids to be around other kids, because other kids don't respond so like they're jerked around so much. So
that's a good point.
They have to learn. But if they spend too much time with just caregivers or helicopter parents or teachers who are like, this makes for a funny so farm children learn very quickly that their father is just like, like there has to be anyways. But we wonder what this is a very interesting superpower I have, right? And I think what happens is in our culture, and I'm just going to say, are problematic, or what Ian McGilchrist would call the modern mind or the left brain. This is a stereotype. I think what happens is that the language is used more to strategize than to allow you into my mind, because what I say is most people are not their authentic eyes, they're their generalized we. And almost everybody's always strategizing that what is their we in this social space. And this is, George Herbert Mead's. But so for me, the problem with language is that there's not a juncture in children's development where the misappropriation of language gets pushed back on, because kids are really clever, and then the parents, so I think what you're saying is right, and I think what we're describing in the adult population is correct, but I think this is not a developmental thing, it's a conditioned thing. when you sit around at, campfire with a bunch of Native Americans or in certain circles, nobody's saying a lot. There's something else happening. You're allowing people into your embodied experience, and words come up and they mean something else. So I would say language, yes, but it's not the kind of language we banter about. That's mostly a deception for most social conversations.
Sure. Yeah. So I want to respond to that. I just want to be clear about what I'm saying is I think that each one of these sort of levels of this loop of how deeply I model myself, how deeply I model my world, corresponds to different temporal scales at which we operate. So if I'm just moving around online, I don't have the same self engagement, self-world engagement as I do when I'm considering long-term planning, moral agency. But that's not as great as like the potential, as you said, the virtuality. So it's not only that I open up the temporal scope, I open up the modal scope. I consider possibilities of myself. So I'm capable of regret. I'm capable of saying, I wish I hadn't done that back then, which that's not a prediction. That's not even trying to map out. That's a taking responsibility that's even more extended because of that ability to internalize perspectives other than my own. So the reason I'm saying that is because none of these timescales are optional to us. We can't say, well, you know what? I'm going to leave aside the online timescale. I don't need that. I'm just going to live up here in narrative. Try that. That doesn't work. Like all of these are mutually interdependent.
Yeah,
so I want to be clear that I wasn't trying to privilege one over the other. I think and this is what I mean why I don't think it's a hierarchy, although I keep using level language just to make it clear. We need a multi-leveled self because the world is at different scales of interaction for us, and we have different problems at each scale. So I just wanted to make that point clear.
Yeah. No, I think we're on the same page. I just wanted to slow down because it's at that juncture that you pointed to that I was saying there's a key leverage point in training and educating there before it gets into hyper narrative and all these social things. And so that's all. And then of course there's many other, I didn't even get into your concept of the person, but I think there's a lot of questions, and I think we could unfold too much too fast, and this would not necessarily make a lot, because I think people are asking questions about what we just said.
Yes.
And if you're willing to kind of talk more about what we already said or whatever questions are coming up,
I'd be happy to do that. Why I brought up that thing is I do think there's tremendous expertise at these pre-linguistic levels. That's what I was trying to say. Right. I know this because when I'm teaching people Tai Chi, they have to learn to drop back down to that pre-linguistic level. And I think there's a kind of self people recover or reacquaint themselves with when they're doing these kinds of practice. I do agree that there is ways in which, language use can cut us off from these these deeper levels of the self, if that's the correct metaphor. What all I meant about the vulnerable, I don't think that, I wanted to distinguish between language as a capacity and then how people use it, right?
Yeah. And I love the fact that what you're doing is you're showing us that even if you're lost in this, the deeper meaning is always accessible or available. Yes. So it's not like it's not there. It's just that, it's like a flame burning really high or something so it's not that. And so I love the way you did that. It's always accessible, so you can stop if you have skills to check in. And very much. So again, I think that was a real gem, just the way you did that. That was really important. So
for me, there's a deep structural, not even an analogy, almost like a mapping or isomorphism between how I talk about the levels of knowing, and the propositional is dependent on the procedural and the perspectival, the perspectival and the participatory. I think in the same way, there are levels of the self-world relationship that track down and have the similar kinds of relation. I think your propositional self that gets extended into personhood and all that wonderful stuff is deeply dependent on your participatory self, etc. So yes, there's a dependency relation downward, right? But there's also a generative relationship upward. New functions are emerging as you move up. You can do things you couldn't do at lower levels.
I think this also, now if we can get back to the ecologies of practice, this I think is an emergent skill, because we tend to, because I think we need to solve complex abstract problems because we're that kind of a civilization, while simultaneously being embedded in these deeper knowings.
Yes,
and
yes.
And some people can toggle, but you feel yourself toggle. And what is it and there's a sense in which, yes, this is always accessible, but there's a sense in which the signifiers and the abstraction starts failing to keep checking in. Like, because it can have a life of its own, and then I call it high play, and you can create all kinds of cool metaphysics, and it's really extraordinarily fun. But I think that it's really hard for, I think, to me, that I think is the frontier, you know, like toggling. I think a lot of people are at this stage where they can check in, and then, but what would it be to be a thinking, feeling being that needs to solve problems at a certain level of expertise that's quite abstract? This, I don't think person exists yet.
You mean a good theoretical reflection on it?
Yeah, well, it would have to be a group, like if you're trying to solve, so because you, in these complex questions, you need a lot of expertise. You might need someone who knows something about the economy, and somebody knows about this, and yet mining this kind of bodies in space and this participatory, intersubjective thing that can happen. Once we start then going back out to the problem, we tend to, it tends to be a different kind of experience. You can get lost in propositional, you know,
very much
interplay of propositions. So,
I think there.
That's it.
I think that I don't want to drag this into the meaning crisis, but I think that we used to give the name of religion to where people were practicing individually and collectively, toggling between all these levels, all the way up from the collective we down into the most deepest participatory I, and also toggling between the presented me and the always observing I, that distinction that James made between the observable self and the part of the self that is not observable because it is the act of observing, and you're right, so you're toggling between like how much you're stepping back and looking at, and you're also toggling between like how it goes into the core of my psychosomatic participation up into the collective we space, right? And religion was about the serious play, the imaginal play of where people practiced getting better at that when it was functioning well. I'm not trying to backhand all the ways in which religions can malfunction and traumatize and harm people, but when it functioned well, it had that functionality, I think, at its core. And I think to the degree to which we haven't figured out how to replace that lost functionality is really impacting our capacity to get the kind of self-knowledge you're talking about. We can talk a lot here, but without the religious arena, it is hard for us to get it, to grok it the way you're talking about, like to feel it in the sinews of the psyche is hard when we do not have an arena where we can properly, seriously play and practice at it.
Yeah, I agree with you. And when you're talking about these arena, it's always, you know, embodied people sitting around, sweat lodge, the debates, the Tibetan scholastics, and it's physical and it's ritualized, and it's and so I think that's when you were saying a religious arena, That
Yes.
is what I'm feeling is, yeah, absent from the equation in many cases. So.
Well, think of the ancient Stoa, to quote a particular place that might be relevant to this community. It was a place in which you walked and you walked back and forth. So the walking and the physical movement, and there was space for gesturing because you were open. That was integral to the practice of the high level propositional discussion, right? There was the continual online contact with embodied agency, spatial temporal navigation that was constantly being kept in connection and communion with the higher level, because the Stoics were always about, if you can't practice it, right, you're not actually a Stoic. If you can't translate it into, right, how you are seeing this moment here now, then you're not a Stoic.
And it reminds me of, I have different associations with Stoicism, but I love that, like walking, the monks walking, and how without saying and just ritualizing, you become, you know, I call it bodies in space, and you realize a lot is already happening. That is extra personhood or transpersonal.
Yes.
But I just want to also say that in my practice also, that we've had experiences here where the whole reality of nature starts, people are saying, what is going on? And there's like an opening to perception, and nature starts to reveal or show itself in a different way. Like one of my students once said, the mountains were coming toward us, the insects were coming toward us, the clouds were coming toward us. There's this palpable participation and reverberation that then is beyond that community that experiences that also. And that is what I would like to create for more people.
Let's slow down on that, because I think that's a very important point. Can I ask you, do you mean that sense of that both nature and the person are participating, they're communing, they're sharing in some, you're not just representing nature, you're instantiating it, you're letting it into your psyche, you're also letting your psyche sort of feel into the world. I'm trying to get at, what does that mean? What does
So first I'll give you the kind of meta explanation, because when I say it, I don't want to reduce it to some kind of what it isn't. But when we know, when you have these deep states, it's not clear whether reality is changing or your perception is changing. And basically you eventually realize there is no difference. I mean, that there, just like we said, there's a participation. So I can't report whether perception, you know, the doors of perception were open and I saw what was always there, but it certainly does not feel like that. There are some times when you have an experience where it feels like that, like you see something for the first time. But this experience is that there are 3 people on a deck after a very intense embodied religio experience, and they walk out on the deck, not saying anything, and something in my environments, like the metaverse, is happening, something that I'm feeling. This is a metaphor, like the trees are swaying and I'm swaying. I'm the swaying of the trees. I'm not sure whose body it's in. And I look over and the other 2 people, their eyes are like this because the same thing's happening to them. And so this is why I would say nature is doing something, because it's not 3 different experiences. Everything's slowed down. We were watching one of the participants walk a dog down the driveway, and everything was slow, and you could hear, this is how we reported it, you could see the swishing but it wasn't like you were seeing the swishing.
No,
The feeling of swishing was here, and the feel. But so what I'm saying, this is why I want to say nature, somehow there's a, if you work with animals, you know this too. There's a certain kind of presence that you can be in the forest and the animals will come. And that's kind of the presence that we had gotten to doing this collective practice. And so it's kind of like that. There's a certain way of being, which also draws not only this religio, but there's this open participation that is even bigger than the self. Or
that's what I wanted to ask you about. So first of all, thank you. That was very beautiful. Your descriptive capacities are really helpful here. So when people talk about these experiences retrospectively, which of course is somewhat problematic, I'll admit that right up front, okay? But when they do, they talk about that often they say things very similar about those kinds of experiences were accompanied by a fundamental change in the sense of self or the experience of self. People will often even use self-transcendence metaphors. I got outside of my usual self, or I got beyond my egocentric self. And for me, that I take those reports very seriously, and it means something from that I think is very core to being a self, but is very almost paradoxical. That part of what it is to be a self is the capacity to transcend a self, to be engaged in self-transcendence, which is a very odd thing. Like we don't find that for other objects sort of typically as we think of them, although I do think objects are beyond themselves in some way. But what I'm trying to get at is I'm not trying to dismiss in any way the phenomenology. I'm trying to get, in fact, I do think what's happening very much is, the way the brain is sort of modeling itself and the way it's modeling the world are becoming deeply interpenetrating. And I don't mean in some dysfunctional fashion. I think in some very powerful augmentation. But what I'm trying to get at is when that's happening, right? How is it? Maybe I'll phrase it a question. That's what I'll do. How is it that we are people will use both of these ways of talking that when you put them propositionally seem to almost contradict each other. People will, well, on one hand say, I was losing myself, but they'll also say, I found myself, or there was a deeper self, or there was a more real, or right. And they use this language of somehow this otherness is really me, but I've gone beyond what I usually am. And yet they feel this to all hang together. When you try and talk about it, you fall into paradox, it sounds like to me. Does that make any sense to you what I'm saying?
So if we were, and I love this, I love playing, I really do this very in a disciplined manner to many students that come to want to work with me, because I think we need to be precise about what was the phenomenon. Right?
Yes.
So we can do things like when I think of transcendent, that word for me is not part of this experience. I've bilocated and all that stuff. I've had, believe me, I have them all. And so I would say self, where is the self? There's a sense that the self is here, but the here is very big.
Yes.
Like it's not like I can meditate pretty easily, derealize the body. I have a perception of the absence of perception, so this is not an absence. It's not a bilocation. It's not those kinds of things. There's a sense that just like if I say, if I ask not the mind, you know, if I ask the body, where are you? Not a big deal. Here. If I ask the mind, where are you? Blah, it's all right. If I ask the body, who are you? It's a trivial question. Here, right? So it's kind of has this, what you see is what you get, but the experience is so vastly richer. I would say there's no egocentrism because you don't really reference it to yourself, but it feels here. I am here. The whole thing is saying here, here. So it has very grounded, but there's less reference. And so then if there's not a lot of egocentric reference, maybe people would say I couldn't find myself or something. Even looking over to my friend was something weird because she was just here. There was not a lot of spatial mapping, but she wasn't in me. So that's the best I can do if I'm trying to be true to the phenomenon. Yeah.
Which is tricky. I get it. I think it's very tricky. I think that was very helpful.
So, and my friend who had that experience is here, so she's just laughing because she recognizes it very well. So, but what for me, why that's important is because it's not like a pre-modern mysticism wrapped up in some kind of pre-modern metaphysics, although I think it's much more common in some indigenous cultures to have these experiences. And so, yeah, so that's an area that I want to go, but maybe, you know, Peter is seeing if we want to pivot here, unless you have something else to say.
No, I think you responded to my question very well.
All right, awesome. I'm just going to remove the spotlight. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. I'm moving the spotlight. So I'll ask a question to warm it up. It's related to the jingle jangle problem, or perhaps a jingle jangle opportunity to be a little more stoic about it. And so when I was like younger, the word self was always so annoying because it's like psychotherapy had different definitions and Buddhist traditions had different definitions, philosophers, self-help. And it was like, I think Ned Block called it the mongrel concept, like a concept that like connotes many different other concepts or denotes many different phenomenon. And the one thing I really liked about Bonnitta's model was like her framework. It was like kind of it took a meta perspective and it kind of housed all these different traditions. And she sort of like delineated the concept of the self into different, kind of like the whole self, the unique self, the deep self, and I think you gesture towards the extended self. And then it was just like, oh, it was amazing because it helped me grok all those different traditions that gesture towards the self or talked about the self in such a deep way for me. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about that, Bonnitta, and maybe just the importance of having like a more sophisticated delineation of the concept of the self.
Yeah, just briefly, you know, the model was created for my course, and its purpose is to do exactly what you said. People come from all different traditions. Some people are looking for the, you know, I've read Gaffney or something about the unique self, and some people about the absolute self, and some people about shamanism, and as we do, we tend to try to see the whole through the lens that we're familiar with. And this follows both for Cognition, because you have the embodied self along that axis, you have the embedded self and larger we's along that axis, you have the enacted self, which goes up to the unique self, so you have to enact the unique self, and then you have the extended self, which is, yeah, I usually don't do too much with that, it's a whole other bag of goods, but what it helps people do is continue in the vein that they feel most comfortable in, and understand that some of the discussion between them and someone else is because they're unfolding at different, unfolding at different levels, let's say, or unfolding different aspects of what it is to be a self. So if you're into development of the identity, that's different than if you're into deconstructing the self down to the no self, which is, and so these things are related in this kind of 4E ecology. And it's important not to confuse one field of discourse as an argument with a different field of discourse. Yeah, so that's really what it's for.
I guess what I would say to both you, Peter, and Bonnitta is, so I'm trying to, I come at it a slightly different way, but I think it's convergent. I'm trying to understand what the functions of these various levels, if we want to use the level metaphor, are, or these various dimensions. And then is there a way in which these functions can be understood to relate to each other in a way that's also functional? So like in robotics, let me give you an example. If you want to get a robot to learn how to move things around, what we typically we thought is give it as much information about the world as it can and then reinforce it endlessly. Now, what you do is you let the robot flail around doing nothing and build a model of itself first. And then its capacity to learn in the environment goes up dramatically. That's what I mean about what's the functionality here. Because what's happening, if you don't do that, the information that the robot is getting is always a conflation of signal from the world and signal from itself. And it doesn't learn how to parse and pull them apart. And it doesn't know how to use one to predict the other. And we're just talking about, and it's really creepy when you watch this because it looks like a baby flailing around.
Yeah, you feel bad because they take off one of its legs and you feel like,
yes,
really, it's like animal, yeah.
Right, so for me, right, what I'm trying to do is to try and get like, what is going on in the functionality? How is it central to our cognitive projects? And like I said, I think what we're using, Peter, is we're using a term that applies at different temporal scales and different modal scales. I can be talking about the self insofar as I move around my room and don't bump into my furniture. I can be talking about the self in terms of what I've done for the day. And I can be talking about myself like Kierkegaard, what is possible for me in my life? And we use the word all the way through. And then we also mix it up with that other use of self, which is the recursive function. And it's very confusing. So I think trying to pull them apart, but show how they're related. And for me, I give special priority, right? Not so much as I don't want to deny the importance of what Bonnitta is doing. I don't give quite as much importance to the pedagogical, right, capacity to intervene on people. Although that's important to me, I want to say that but I'm also involved in this other project of trying to make agents, right? Which is a different project, which is what is emerging because of 4E cognitive sciences. You don't make a good agent unless you've got this multi-temporal, multimodal self-modeling going on. The brain models itself in order to model the world and improves its model of itself by modeling the world. Those two things are bound up together inextricably. So although there's been, what I'm trying to say, Peter, is although there's equivocation and confusion, there is a way in which you can find a deep functional integration that you can bring to resolve the confusion. At least that's what I would argue.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat with, wait, does the robot actually model itself? And yes, in those videos, it's got, it's got in the software, it's got like a lot of where it's been and what it is. And I can't find this one, but I saw one where I think they were Princeton students. They were creeped out because the AI started looking at them to see if
Yes.
that was salient in the solution space, and it started tracking their faces, which is completely freaky. But I can't actually find that one anymore. I've looked up for it.
That strikes me as, given what Tomasello has said about joint attention, that strikes me as very plausible. I would say that there is an important difference, maybe the questioner is wanting to note, which is the robot is modeling itself, but it's not modeling itself for itself. It's modeling itself for us. And presumably the infant, while it is modeling itself for us, it's also primarily modeling itself for itself. And that's a fundamental difference. And perhaps the questioner was wanting to get clear about that. We don't have, because none of our robots are self-making, are autopoietic, they don't actually care for themselves. They don't care about themselves. And so anything they're doing like this is ultimately for us and not for themselves.
All right. That was awesome. So let's pivot to the Q&A. We might just have time for one. Aaron, you had a couple of questions. If you can unmute yourself.
Hey, thanks, Peter. I'll ask my previous question. Let's say, how does the self interact with the internet, or what effect is the internet having on our notion of self? I have the impression that the internet is rapidly changing our notion of self, and I was wondering if you could riff on that a bit. Thanks.
Should I go first this time, or how do you want to do it?
I'll go first because I think I have a kind of a short answer, and then maybe you can go ahead. I know you have time. So for me, what's interesting, my question about the internet is ties into how the young child core self, I call it, its job is to organize self, other, and world. And there are clear rules, like your robot, how's it doing that? It's autopoietic. And there are clear ways that we know that happens now, mostly based on work of Alison Gopnik. And that is what always comes with me. I mean, I can see that this is moving, and I can feel it's moving, and it co-varies with me, or it's invariant to my internal state that becomes self. Whatever is what doesn't vary, I use that term wrong, but I'm not going to try to figure it out. Though if I hit my head against the wall, it has no response, so that's world. And for people and pets, they co-vary. I can tell they're responding to me, but it's not exactly the same thing. And the child goes through different stages where each of these kinds of experiences, they spend a lot of time trying to figure it out. Now, the internet has such a seamless interface. It's a thing, and I can't remember now which word it is, but it's like my body. And as the internet becomes haptic and virtual reality, you're basically hacking the self other world system of the individual. And I think that's kind of interesting.
I think that's right. First of all, I think the first answer to your question, I would say as a scientist, is we don't know. We're running this horrible experiment, and we're running it horribly. We don't know what the consequences are going to be. We haven't set up the conditions. We don't know what the relevant variables are. We're doing a very, very, very powerful experiment, and it's been very, very poorly set up. And we've decided that the market is the best way to organize this. The market does not run experiments well. So that's my first response. My more speculative response is that, like Bonnitta said, I think it's hijacking the machinery by which self and non-self are mediated very powerfully, especially with avatars that are in the virtual space. I would point out that it's hijacking another important aspect, you have, and I mean this in a proper sense, you have a virtual imaginal relationship to your future self. Very, this is very concrete, Hirschfield and others people's work. If I give you all the rational arguments why you should save money for your retirement, you won't do it. If I get you to imagine your future self as an older person that you love and care about, you will do it. And the more vivid the image is, the more likely you will actually enter into saving for your retirement. This is just one example of how imaginal, not imaginary, how imaginal the self is, because the self is always relating to, right, the past and the future in this imaginal fashion. And the problem with that is that not only do I think that that the self-world machinery is being hijacked and manipulated, I think the self to self, the aspirational relationship that's at the core of being a self is that has huge existential impact. So the degree to which people are connected to their future self is deeply predictive of how meaningful they find their lives. And when the internet hijacks that imaginal relation to the future self and displaces it, people will find a huge impact on their meaning in life without realizing why. And I think this is very prevalent. And so you find increasing number of people who prefer to live in the virtual world. Like, this is a phenomena you can measure. How many of you would rather be in the real world or in the virtual? Well, I want to be in the virtual world more, which is a crazy place to have gotten to. And so that means that they are relating to their presence in the virtual world in place of relating to their future self. And I think that is deeply, deeply destructive of our capacities for meaning making. And so I think the medium, independent, above and beyond all that horrific content, I think the medium itself is destructive of our capacities for meaning making.
You know, that's really interesting. Hartshorne argued that the only true moral decision you could make is your responsibility to your future self.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so we also know how that works in this way of hacking that. I think what problematizes it is not only the medium, but that the medium is not, as you said, it's part of the market, and it's not it's not as autopoetic as just a bunch of people on a virtual platform. There are agendas and choices and incentives that are not part of the experiment. They're constraints on the experiment. So
yeah, and often hidden deliberately. So in a minute, there's a lot. Yeah, there is bad faith actors within it.
And the other question I have is like it always comes up to this, but we're on Zoom, and it's interesting because we can project reality, and I can have an affective experience with you. But we know from, for example, that the neuroscience of we have a body image and a body schema.
Yes.
And there's and our body image is kind of like how we know, schema is how we know where we are in space. And the image is kind of a third person mapping that we always kind of have a third person perspective on ourselves, which is why under altered state, you could do remote viewing, because that's always there anyways. But there are examples of people who lose the body schema and they can learn to walk again, but it's like learning how to dance. They're like robotic because they have to put more intentionality into it. So what I'm saying is that because we've all had basically real world upbringings, we are able to project that into pixels. And eventually you might set, so there's an asymmetry. I spent 90% of my life in the real world, 10% online, but as that asymmetry rolls back, these mechanisms will get atrophied. So now what are you going to have? You're going to have some kind of virtual reality with what kind of projection? Does that system start creating? I don't know. It's like, it's just really It's getting at these, it's hacking some fundamental leverage points of the human system.
Very much so. I mean, on top of it, hacking the basic salience machinery, relevance realization machinery. So I think all of these things are interwoven. I think your question, Aaron, it's just like, it's overwhelming to try and answer it.
And yet, the curiosity of the human spirit wants to know, is willing to go there. And yet,
any follow-up share, Aaron?
I just said mission accomplished, with the question being overwhelming and impossible to answer. So thank you guys.
Instead of trying to sneak in one last question, because John has to go in about 5 minutes, I thought maybe we can close with both Bonnitta and John taking turns on saying maybe where they would like to continue the conversation with each other, either on Bonnitta's pop-up school or John's channel or at the Stoa. Maybe what's one area or thread that you would like to continue this conversation or another conversation between the two of you?
I'm happy, and I would like to talk to Bonnitta again. I'm hoping I can get her onto Voices with Vervaeke, so I'll definitely reach out. I guess I want to do more of what we're doing. We have slightly different emphasis and where we're coming from, but there's a lot of convergence. I think there's more of a phenomenological richness, and I mean that, and that's an important thing in what Bonnitta is doing. And it is more tied up, more closely tied to the bottom-up data. And I'm not using that in a pejorative way, of people actually interacting with each other in the environment, and to put that into more communication with where I come from. Although I do try to stay connected to that stuff, I do tend to come at it as like from a cognitive scientist, a design stance, trying to understand a lot of the cognitive, and I use cognition very broadly, by the way. The cognitive functionality at work there, like what would go into actually, if you tried to make an agent and a self, what would you be trying to do that? That's a kind of question. And so I would like to just do more of that. I'd like to do more of getting them to map onto each other, seeing where they diverge, and seeing more of how they converge. Because one of the problems I have, one of my besetting sins, is that I often prefer to spin through theory space a little too much, and don't get enough contact down with transformative interaction. So I found this very, very helpful. Like when we zoomed in and Bonnitta was opening up about just that I won't call it a moment in the sense of a second, but that moment of that sort of participatory conformity between people and their world. I thought that was wonderful. I thought that was extremely helpful for me to be able to zoom in and open that up and look at it more carefully.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I love the cognitive stuff, and it's not that I was not wanting to go there, but I was wanting to go slowly,
Mm-hmm.
so that so we do build, because I think that, we tend to just start playing different language games, and so it's very hard to bridge that. I would say an in for that conversation is the notion of extended cognition.
Yes.
Like how we extend our bodies onto instruments, musical instruments, what's happening there, and then our minds onto computers, and now our psyches into the virtual world. Are these iterations of some same basic principles? That would be an interesting question.
I would love to talk to you about that question. I'm very much involved with that question right now. So I would love to talk to you about that. Talk with you about that.
Beautiful. So hopefully further conversations, some conversational seeds have been planted. Looking forward to it continuing. I'll make some announcements in a moment. But Bonnitta, John, thank you so much for coming today. beautiful inquiry and conversation. And if anybody wants to continue this right after, I'm going to close this down shortly, but if anyone want to continue it, just put the Zoom link and you can continue this off the Stoa. 2 events I'll just plug at the Stoa. Tomorrow, Bimboism, no thoughts, just vibes. That's it's a new mimetic tribe on TikTok. It's actually quite fascinating. So someone is going to come and present on that. So that should be interesting. And then Game B, and then the Dark Renaissance is going to have a meeting. So Jim Rudd, Alexander Bard, Cadell Last, and Zach Stein are going to have a follow-up conversation from the Dark Renaissance conversation that we had here a little while ago. So that's going to be announced today. So you can RSVP to that. Yep, Bonnitta's getting the gloves off. So that being said, everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today.